Okay, good morning, everyone. What a beautiful day to start our discussion on literary translation. So I'm very excited about the opportunity, and I'm very grateful for the Writers Guild of Alberta opening such a space for us to talk a little bit about literary translation, which increasingly I would say become important in this globalized world. So I'll just start with introduction of the panelists, including myself, and then we'll start our discussion by following the outlines I prepared and shared with the panelists. Peter Midgley spent more than a decade in publishing before returning to full-time writing and editing. He was written and edited. He wrote and edited 12 books for children and adults, and has done more than 40 translations of scholarly works and children's picture books. His editorial acumen has netted him both Tom Fairley Award for Editorial Excellence and the Lewis Hall Award for Editorial Excellence. He is a past president of the Writers Guild of Alberta. His latest book of poetry, Let Us Not Think of Them as Barbarians, coming out from, already published from New West Press, was shortlisted for the Stephen G. Stephenson Award. His work has been shortlisted for the 2021 AMPA Awards and for the WGA's John White Memorial Essays. And Susan Ouriou is an award-winning literary translator and fiction writer who has published numerous translations from Spanish and French into English, for which she has won the Governor General's Award for Literary Translation, among others. Her translations of Quebec writers' work for publication in 2021 to 22 include The Lover, The Lake by Virginia Pesemapeo Bordelot, forgive my pronunciation, published by House of Annecy, and then Truffle by Fanny Britt, published by August Books, and The Future by Catherine Leroux'sThe, published by Biblioessays. She also co-founded the Banff International Literary Translation Center residency and was its director for 3 years. She has published 2 novels of her own, Damn Selfish and Nathan, and is currently writing the play Urgency with a collective of women writers and knowledge keepers. Leilei Chen, myself, is a literary translator, bilingual writer, and a scholar. I published the Mandarin version of Nationalism, a very short introduction, with China's Yiling Press in 2017, and Oxford University Press in Hong Kong in 2020. I wrote Reorienting China, Travel Writing and Cross-Cultural Understanding, published by University of Regina Press in 2016. My poetry and prose translations and personal essays appears in anthologies and literary journals in Canada and beyond. And I currently has the honor of serving as the Vice President of Western Canada on the board of Literary Translators Association of Canada. Okay, so I move on to questions. So I want to talk about the kind of common task of both writers and translators, the craft of translation, the craft of, I was kind of reversing the order of the questions. So, so the common task of editing, obviously, both for writers and translators. So what is the editing process, especially for a translator? I would like to hear from the panelists of what's your experience like and share some insights of the editorial process. So I would, so anyone who want to go ahead? Susan, maybe first.
Okay, so you wanted us to talk about the editorial process and not translation per se?
Translation, yeah, I mean the editorial process of a translated work. That's the question, yeah.
Well, I've had the good fortune to work with a number of publishers here in Canada and of course in Quebec and overseas, because the rights to their authors have been bought by Canadian publishers. And I do find that editing a translation is different from editing regular work because the editor has to be aware of the other culture in a way and of that fact. But insofar as the translation itself is concerned, the translator is bent on creating the same notional and emotional experience for the reader. In other words, that the reader comes away with the same pictures in mind, with the same facts, and also with the same emotions, that the same paragraphs that elicited tears or laughter in the original will do the same in the translation. So I have, over the course of my 30+ year career, I have only worked with 2, I think, editors who actually knew the language I was translating from. So the editor does not need to know the original language in order to translate in order to edit the translation. But it was a special treat working with editors who actually knew the French as well, so we could have discussions about that. And now I guess Peter's the official editor here, so I'd love to hear what Peter has to say.
Yeah, Peter, please go ahead.
Yeah, speaking from the editorial process, you are quite right, Susan. It's a very, very different process in that you're aware of the fact that very often you do not have knowledge of that language. So you have to become more of a listener than a guardian of grammar, if that makes sense, because what you're doing is you're not listening necessarily for or trying to put everything into cultural fluency in the target language, because one of the reasons we read translation is very much to experience other cultures, to learn about new languages, and to enrich our own vocabulary and language. So what we do is, if we just fully translate that into another English text so that it is seamless and completely immersed in our culture, we're doing a disservice by accentuating the centrality and the primacy of English in this instance, which is the most common language for translation into the language, and reasserting its dominance, whereas the trend is to recognize other cultures, and it is also a way to experience. So you have to listen very carefully to make sure that it is understandable, but not just turning it into another English book in terms of its idiom, in terms of the grammar of the language. I remember when I was teaching at a university in South Africa, where the majority of our students were second or even third or fourth language speakers of English. And the essays would come in, and the inflections of the person's native tongue, mother tongue, would be in the English grammar, and you have to allow for that. So the editorial process is very different. You have to become very much more aware of your role as listener and to seek clarity, but not to interfere with the timbre of the language.
I do find that I keep the reader central in mind too, is I want
Yeah.
them to have more or less the same experience. So something that is very odd in French or Spanish, I will make very odd in English. But if something just flows, the author hasn't done anything to demarcate what they're doing in that passage, it will be the same in English. But obviously the concerns, what's the way of dealing the style is often very proper to the language, and we have to be aware of that in English and to see how it translates.
You know, and in terms of translation, a fair bit of the translation that I have done has been collaborating with speakers of other languages, where we work to translate, say, oral poetry, where the form is already, it's an oral form, so you already have to work to transcribe that into a written form, which shifts the medium, and then you have to translate. So your translation is already a second remove from the original, in which case you have to be aware of course, you have some knowledge of the original, but you are knowing that you are working with speakers and translators and interpreters, as well as just curating a text. So you have to be aware of orality as well as cultural reference there. It's a very different process and a very collaborative process. I don't think that you can do translation without collaboration.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what you guys have discussed already touches upon the other question I have here. So I constantly struggle in balancing between keeping the foreign elements of the original and rendering the text appealing to the readers. So how do you balance between the two? Yeah, I want you to talk a little bit about this.
Susan, go.
Well, I mean, I'm a born reader. And the day I was able to read in French and then in Spanish was one of the best days in my life. And so mostly I want to, when I read a book that I love in French or Spanish, I want to ensure that an English reader gets that same experience. So mine is much more based on what the text elicits and how I can go about doing that in English. I've translated a number of novelists who are very poetic. Being poetic in English is not the same as in French or in Spanish. So it's finding, and to me, I guess that's what helps me, is thinking, how did this affect me and how can I make sure it affects other readers in English the same? And it's part of what I learned to do with studying translation was what they call deverbalize. So you understand the original and then you get away from the words and you live kind of in that space as you re-express it and then compare back to the original, of course.
Yes, and I agree with you, but then at the end of that, after having gotten away, you have to return to it again and pull it back. So the translation happens in that level of finding the music, finding the poetry, and a good example of this, for instance, is often translations from French with older poetry, because older French poetry relies on the Alexandrine as the metrical patterning, but the Alexandrine is not a natural rhythm in English poetry, where the natural rhythm is iambic. So you've got to, because you're working with a foreign metrical system that works for there, and so you have to find a way to bring that into an English metrical pattern that works. The Alexandrine is difficult to manage in English. The same happens with Latin poetry, where a lot of Latin poetry is governed strictly by metrical patterns. And word order is not an issue, whereas in English, we are freer in terms of the metrical patterning, but our word order does matter. So So you've got to be aware of that in bringing in the fluency in reading the English, but an awareness of trying to imitate what was in the original and finding replacement techniques that will give that same feeling and that emotional content that you wish to convey, or that surprised you and drew you to the original.
So we've already into the next question, the craft of translation. I'm so glad all the things are kind of connected. Yeah. So what are some of the skills or, the crafts specifically of translation that you've acquired or, used often in the translation process? So I'm curious, as a learner still myself, I want to hear from Susan maybe, and then Peter.
I think one of the things that helped me the most was, oh, there's a lot of noise outside, but actually, Peter, can you go on? I'm going to ask that they stop. Okay, it stopped. Sorry. Is subtext. And I find I've done a lot of editing or jurying of translations as well. And any great literary text has a subtext. And it's amazing. I remember reading a translation of a great Quebec author, but I read it first in English. In translation, I thought, this is just so flat. Like, how could this have been penned by this great Quebec author? And then I went back and read the French, and of course it was a great story. And it was because of the subtext. And I really think that the translator had not seen any of the subtext and had just translated the words on the page. And it's the subtext that gives body, that gives shape, both to the original and to the translation. And I'm not saying that you say it in words, but when you've understood it, it comes out in the words you choose and in the way you express what was expressed by the original author. Peter?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Peter, yeah, go ahead.
It's a tricky one, because I think Susan's covered it, is that you've got to be, you have to, before you can begin to translate a text, you have to have read it several times. You have to have understood the subtexts, and you should not be afraid to ask questions. If you have the luxury of working with an author who is still alive, to ask questions and say, wait, am I reading this correctly? Are you hinting at something here? And then you have to try and find contexts and subtexts. And this, I think we will come back to this again later if we get to that point of talking about who should be translating texts, because I think all of this is important. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in a seminal book that is written for about writing and about language, which is Decolonizing the Mind, is not so much, it talks about how writers who write in a second language and write in English, if that's not their mother language, how they enrich the English language and how translation can help with that. And I think that when we are translating, we have to be aware, subtext is what brings us that enrichment. It brings us those other cultural contexts. It leads us to an understanding of the society. This is why I know when I was learning French, and believe me, I'm still very much a learner of French, one of the most important modules in that course was a module on French culture, because if you don't understand the cultural nuances and the cultural references, you can't hope to gain fluency in the language. And it's that cultural fluency that becomes the most difficult thing. And this will feed into future discussions, is when we look at the constitution of who are the translators and who are the favored translators, very often the politics of translation comes into here as well, with people who don't have the cultural fluency to be translating, who are doing the translation. So again, I think this feeds into subtext. I think goes into that. It takes an incredible awareness as a translator. It's a tough job.
I totally agree. I totally agree. But these are very good discussions. And I think we have questions in the chat. We'll leave time for Q&A at the end of the session after we finish all the questions. So now I'm going to move on to the process of getting a work translated and published. So how does a writer find a suitable translator for his or her or their work? So I don't know if there's a contractual relationship between the writer and the translator. So I want to hear from you people based on your experience and insights. Susan, go ahead, please.
My experience is mostly that publishers are the ones who contract translators. And so, but what you can do is if you've written an author who isn't translated and you're in love with that author, you can then go to different publishers and suggest a translation of that author. Another way for authors to start small, if they haven't written a blockbuster that's being picked up by publishers around the world and being translated, and those publishers are hiring the translators. There are, for example, translation literary journals. And if a short story of yours, a poem of yours is translated by a translator into whatever language and appears in that literary anthology, that's one way of getting your foot in the door. But mostly the writer's job is to write a fantastic book that people will want to read in other languages. And of course, books that win prizes or receive a distinction of some sort, I think, do sometimes draw the attention of other publishers more. But I worked at the Banff Center in the Literary Translators residency. I've worked with translators from all around the world, and a lot of them are just contracted by the publisher to do a translation of a book the publisher has bought rights to. But a number of times when the translator falls in love with the book, they will then bring it to the publisher.
Peter, go ahead.
Yes, in the conventional sense, yes, it is generally publisher driven because the rights to sell translation rights is part of the contract that an author signs with the publisher, and that falls under the subsidiary rights. And we can go into that in a bit more, but what it basically means is that the publisher, as part of the license to promote the work, has the right to sell the translation rights. And once they've sold the rights, it is the foreign language policy, the target language publisher who has to find a translator. And so they will mostly approach it. But yes, as a writer or a translator, you can establish relations with somebody and pitch a translation and say, you know, this is a culturally significant text. It should be translated, and make the case for why it should be translated. But very often translations also grow out of informal relations. I mean, a lot of the work that I've done, especially with collaboration work, where I've worked with indigenous languages in Southern Africa, has been where I have read work about an author or read a snippet of a translation and have gone out to seek particular work to understand a particular genre more. And in that way, built up a collaboration. And then I use my contacts in a different world to pitch the work. But so you don't necessarily have to go there. Often it can be a learning experience and work back. And so it's personal networking. It is the publisher's responsibility. It is a knowledge of authors to say to an author, hey, that's a great book. Has it been translated? No, it hasn't. Well, do you want to speak to your publisher? So the importance here is to go to translation fairs, to be known in the literary community that you're working in, or in the scholarly circles as a translator of that material, to really make those connections and work with them. There are no hard and fast rules about who does the translation.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, so for emerging translators, my story, recently I contacted an author who is a very prolific Chinese novelist, and I said, can I translate your novel? I'm lucky because he said, yes, this novel is available for translation. So I guess the contact obviously is for me to ask for permission, right? Translation permission. But then he asked, if you and I can sign a contract. I don't know how to respond in the situation. So I don't know what is the relationship between a translator and a writer in terms of this kind of a legal issue of signing a contract. Have any one of you had this experience or insights?
Yes, absolutely. Whenever you enter into any relation to do work as a freelancer, you should be signing a contract. Mm-hmm. There's the simple answer to that. You are signing away the work. You need to understand what your rights and what your responsibilities are as a translator, and the author needs to have very clear outlines as to who is going to be there. You have to figure this out. Is, for instance, a very simple thing is who is going to own copyright in the translation. Is this a work for hire where you own the copyright until that moment when the job is finished and you've been paid your money and it's out there and you're done? That's it. You have no more control over the text as such. Or if you've signed an agreement where your involvement will continue beyond that, you have to clear up the terms of what you are doing. It's a business contract. Absolutely, sign a contract.
Mm. I would add, Lily, you're a member of the Literary Translators Association of Canada. They have a standard contract. Yes. Of course, the contract's between translators and publishers, but you can easily switch the publisher's name to the author if the author wants to sign a contract with you and is ready to pay you. And I would also suggest, I don't know any translator who works as a translator for hire. We all keep copyright on our translation. And so I would suggest you do that. It's your work. It wouldn't exist in English if you hadn't done it. And the English text is your work.
Okay, thank you.
I just to add that I have done where I have released my copyright, but those are mostly for projects where I know that the profits to the work are going towards good causes. For instance, one of the first translation projects that I worked on was to help translate a set of stories into indigenous languages, and I did the Afrikaans translation, but I gave the organization READ, which is the literacy promotion organization, the rights to that book, because all the money that came out of the book went to the organization. So I have absolutely signed away my copyright, but that is because I consider that was my choice to do that.
And to tell you the truth, copyright, because many of our contracts will say we can earn money off of the copyright on top of what we were paid, as of, for example, 5,000 copies sold. Well, 5,000 copies sold in Canada is a lot. So often copyright doesn't mean any more money, but it does mean ownership. So.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that also connects to what Peter mentioned earlier about, how literary translation is a collaborative process, right? You need to negotiate with the writer, the publisher, and so it's a very complicated process, and it's really, really hard work. So, okay, so my next question is, how does a writer help a publisher for the translated version of their work, both in terms of, I guess, the production of the translation, as well as the publication, the ultimate publication of the work. So I hope that question will join two communities together. So yeah, I want to hear from the panelists' point of view on this.
I don't know if I would call it helping the publisher, but it's in my contract. I have final say, so it is a back and forth. I send in my finished manuscript. They have their copy editor go through it, comes back to me with suggestions, which I accept, or I come up with a different solution, or which I reject. And that's the way we get to a finished version. And then once I've given the green light for that version, then it goes to the printers, and I really don't have any part in the rest of what happens.
Yes, I don't think that if you work through a publisher, that you are ever going to, or are likely to encounter a situation where you are not asked for your input and for some form of collaboration in the editorial process. On the writing side, it's a little different. I mean, I know of many cases where a translator or foreign rights were sold, and the translator that the publisher picked never communicated with the author. Now, I think that as a translator, you should be trying to connect with an author if you can, simply because that's how you get to the best kind of translation, is by asking questions, and it can lead to mistranslations and misinterpretations of things. Of course, it is also a leap of faith for the author, because if you are translating into a language where you do not speak the target language, then you simply have to trust that this translation is going to be done, and then it is up to the publisher to ensure that the translator is working ethically by contacting the author if that is feasible, and has the relevant cultural knowledge to do it. A lot of this rests on the publishers, I think, to make sure that it is a problem. And this is partly why translation is such a small part of the market in book publishing, is because it is expensive and requires a lot of dedication and commitment to doing it right.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to open the space for questions among ourselves a little bit more. So I think I've asked many questions. So are there any questions from Peter and Susan, and then you want to bring up for discussion and sharing with our audience?
I wouldn't mind giving people a bit of a sense of why we translate, because authors would be interested in that. So I'm going to try and put something up on the screen. I hope that will work. So these are quotes that appeared. I'll show where they appeared. So does that appear on the screen now?
I don't see it.
I'm not seeing anything.
Are you sharing your screen?
Yes.
Susan, are you sharing your screen?
Yes.
Did you select the document beforehand? From the
I selected the document, but maybe I didn't hit share screen. So let me try that again. No, I don't think it's working. I guess I don't know how to share screen. Anyway, I'll just read from this quote in order for you to see what I'm referring to. So this is Paulo da Costa, who translates from Portuguese and writes in English and Portuguese. said, an important part of what inspires me to bring texts across languages and cultures is a desire to hear the immense diversity of human approaches to perceiving and singing our inner and outer worlds. And that is, I mean, the more we can hear from people from different languages, different cultures, different ways of thought, the more open we become to the rest of mankind. And then there's one by Lorna Crozier, and the whole earth is of one language and one speech. Deer talks to woman and woman to fox, no mistrust or fear. Magpie chats with muskrat, and oh, the grass, how wet and eloquent its green jive with the rain. So, as I say, for me, that is why I translate. That is why I read translations in languages that I can't speak myself. And that is why I would love it if every writer in the world could be translated so that we can exchange and know more about each other and understand each other better.
Yes, I think that is it. It's that enrichment of the human experience is also why I translate. It is to bring different viewpoints, different insights, and especially when you're living in a country like Canada, for instance, which we live in such a contradictory society here, in the sense that we say to each other, it's this multicultural society, and yet we celebrate it on that multiculturalism, that diversity only at certain levels. And translation is one way to do it, but also lends to official bilingualism in Canada, for instance, is a very odd creature. It often gets interpreted as the right to have work translated into the other official language rather than fluency in both official languages. And that, to me, that's not bilingualism. The same comes with multiculturalism, where our population and our demographic is changing so rapidly. Just in Edmonton, for instance, we know that somewhere around 24% of the people in Edmonton are comfortable performing all of their day's tasks in languages other than English. And yet English is the only official language in the province. We know that various Mandarin, we know that Tagalog, we know that these, the language will come to me right now. I've got a blank on it. But some of the major languages from Ethiopia are among the fastest growing languages. And our population diversity is growing faster, yet we don't recognize this. Translation is one way to bring that diversity to the fore and to bring people from peripheral, marginal situations into our culture and our cultural experience. So it is not necessarily only to go out to other countries and learn about the exotic out there. The reality is, that I'm trying to say is that those cultures are here. They are part of Canada. This is not about learning about foreign places. This is learning about who we are now, right here.
On that same note, I would say that I think that every school child in Canada should learn in the elementary grades one or several of the first languages of their region, because and that, no matter where they have come from, is we all, whether we're recent immigrants or settlers from much further back, we all need to know about the actual history of our land. And that starts with the language, which gives you an understanding of the land and which allows you to go forward from there. So I was happy to hear that you're working with Indigenous languages, South African Indigenous languages, Peter. And I've, over the past few years, I've taken Blackfoot and Cree, and I've been working both with Banff's Indigenous Writers Program and with people from all over to ensure that those Indigenous languages aren't lost, and that we realize the importance of them for all of us.
I will say I am also trying to learn Cree as well. It's a slow process, and again, it's just so it's just such a very different experience learning it is.
Language is very hard. Yeah, learning language is very hard. So from a personal perspective, why I translate, you know, it's so funny. If you live between languages and cultures, you can't avoid translation at all. You're constantly encountering these translational moments. You know, I have a Chinese family. My partner is Chinese. My daughter also speaks fluently Mandarin. So Mandarin is one of the major languages we speak at home. And I read Chinese literature, and I enjoy doing that. But you know, I'm trained in English studies, so I read English literature too. How can I avoid this? So when I was very young, in high school, actually, I had this dream. I was so inspired by reading foreign literatures in translation. Fu Lei, who is a great translator, very well-known Chinese translator of Romain Rolland, a French novelist. And I was so inspired by his work. And then I dreamed of becoming a literary translator myself. And that actually made me become an English major in the university. But, you know, I've been following this kind of institutional route for so long. And I realized, you know, translation wasn't encouraged at all by the system because, well, if you publish a translation work, you're not going to be promoted to professors. So that was my experience in China, working in a Chinese university. And it seems that Canada has a similar situation, right? So how literary translation is valued and is credited at the institutional level, I think it's better here. Well, I'm comparing, you know, I guess on the historical plane. So things are moving. I believe in China too. But this is my kind of personal journey of traveling, you know, between languages and cultures. And at this point, I feel, you know, this is something that I want to do. I don't want to keep delaying it. You know, I had this dream as a teenager, but now I'm over 50 already. And I traveled a lot in between two languages and cultures, and I want to do something about it. So that's my kind of personal perspective. I need to do translation in order to feel the meaning of life, basically. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. So I want to open, again, you know, any other questions from Susan and Peter you want to communicate?
Well, I'm looking at the questions in the chat. So there was a question about how to convey the meaning without metaphor. Or do you try to find a metaphor that does work when you have a metaphor in the original? And honestly, I can't give a blanket response to that. It really depends on the text and what's being used and whether it's more a cliche or whether the author is trying to push new boundaries with their metaphors. So I'm not sure that I can give one response to that. And then there was also a question whether we translate into English only or English into the languages you work in. I normally translate from Spanish and French into English. I have done a bit of children's work, children's books into French, but my main focus is French and Spanish into English, and also one Italian short story into English. And can you talk about translating local or regional dialects into English? Any examples? Well, and once again, it's based on each project for me is what role that local or regional dialect had and how I'm going to show the difference in English. And I'll try when I'm not speaking, I'll try to look up an example. And then there's one last question, but maybe Peter wants to answer the first two.
Yes, the matter of metaphor is it's very difficult because metaphor is often so culturally specific, and it's not easy to translate it. So what I tend to do is, if there isn't a direct equivalent, and even a direct equivalent is not always appropriate. So you have to try and find a way to relay the context of that and the sense of a meaning. Sometimes it means coming up with your own new metaphor to coin a different phrase. Sometimes it helps to just translate it literally and leave it as that. And that is part of the foreignness that Susan spoke about earlier, is to say there is no accurate equivalent in English. So just throw it out there as it stands, literally. And you may then deviate slightly by saying, throwing out that slightly awkward translation. It's as we say in da 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 da, here is your metaphor, which is roughly, and then you try and explain, give a little bit more context to it in the translation. We tend to think, or I tend to think, that we think that translation has to be a word for word rendition of the original. It is not necessarily. Sometimes you have to give a little bit more cultural information. Sometimes you can't just translate the words that are on the page. You have to give and take at times to make things work. Of course, you want to stay true to the text, but you have to be aware of being able to be flexible around these things. And metaphor is one of those spots where you have to consider how you're going to do it. Direct, indirect, new contexts, new metaphors. It's a case-by-case discussion.
Absolutely. In 1 out of 100 cases, sometimes you're aesthetically joyful for being able to find the exact equivalent, in the target language. I was teaching this Robert Burns poem, A Red, Red Rose, and I was so happy when reading, I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gone dry. The way how love is described in this poem corresponds to a Chinese idiom. And I was teaching my Chinese students, I said, we say the same thing, exactly the same thing. But with, metaphors, I would, if I cannot find the equivalent, I tend to do literary translation. Unless the terminology involves a foreign cultural element, say the process of making cheese, for my Chinese readers, they may need to know more about the process in order to know my literary translation of a particular term, right? I probably will have a footnote. I hate footnotes. I know it's an academic way of writing, but so my literary fiction, my creative writing editors won't like footnotes, I know. But yeah, that's what I would do. Luckily I can find an equivalent. Unluckily, I would just do literary translation, and then even least lucky is to explain the process to my readers. I believe things are, I know there's a saying that things are untranslatable, but that, to me, a translator is a myth. I think things are translated, are able to be translated. It really depends on how really depends your perspective about translation. So that's my point of view.
Okay. What helps is keeping in mind the reader. And if the reader in French, if one word brings up a whole host of associations that are important to the rest, I may add a word or two in English, but not a footnote, not anything. It's just the reader has the same information in mind, which allows them to.
I do want to touch, just moving on there to the question of dialect, translating regional dialect. I mean, this is a very, very difficult one, and one that is for me very difficult. There are two aspects to this. In the first is, I mean, there's, in French you say have Breton, and that is I mean, just the pronunciation is different. Even the language, the way the language is used regionally is different. Now, the minute we translate that into English, it's very easy to start making classist distinctions here. So we may take that and translate it into, say, a working class dialect, which is not accurate because we're doing, so we have to be very, very careful when you're dealing with dialect, doing that, and also be very aware that many languages, Cree being one of them, there is no single thing called Cree. There are many, I don't want to say dialects, they are languages. isiXhosa, which I speak, isiXhosa, the written language, isiXhosa, is really two of the primary dialects that were in the regions that were where the missionaries settled and set up printing presses, and those dialects became the literary languages. But it's really something like 37 different languages that are mutually intelligible, and Cree is like that as well. There are multiple languages that are mutually intelligible, but for a literary purpose. So how do we negotiate this? So in English, we have now reached a standardized form. I can think of the simplest here is in English and Scots, which are different. They're very different. And it's a really difficult question to just answer here as how to translate dialect, because you cannot find those similar dialect equivalents with the same cultural connotation here. I don't have an answer for you on how to translate dialect, because, and then there is a tendency I see, for instance, on YouTube videos, when people are speaking in English, but these are various dialectic forms of English, that they are subtitled into a standard English. And I am infuriated by that, because part of the richness of our English language is this immense variance in how we speak and use the language. It's intelligible if you just do a little bit of work. Sorry.
I'd like to give an example of, as I say, every project requires its own solution. But the first book I translated from Spain was Planicio. And the main character lives in Barcelona, but is from the Basque country. And so they always have him, whenever he says a C, a th, they have it written with an S. So, you know, at the beginning, the first time that happens, I said more or less, you know, with his Basque accent where he uses, and then I didn't change the spelling every time he used a C throughout the English, because it just made no sense. So that in the Spanish text, it was to show that he wasn't from Barcelona, and that was laid out kind of the first time, and we keep it in mind throughout the novel. But that was the solution I used in one, and it wouldn't be one I'd use in another text. So.
Yeah, it's a case-specific question, I guess. It's very hard to translate dialect, and I was, you know, recently I read an article of about literary translation and how important to translate the voice, the authentic voice of the original. Can you capture the narrative voice or the voice of a character speaking, you know, in the book? So I guess that has to do with voice. It's this kind of, there's a connection there between the question and my reading recently. Yeah, any other questions? I guess we can open, maybe open the discussion to the audience.
I will go back to that one question of do I translate into languages? I translate primarily from Afrikaans into English, and I do translate back into Afrikaans as well. So I grew up in a bilingual household, so I spoke both. I have two mother tongues, as it were. So I have absolute fluency in both of those languages. So I do try and cross-translate. But for other languages that I've learned, like Dutch, for instance, I translate from Dutch into English. I don't, or Afrikaans. I translate into both English and Afrikaans from Dutch. But I don't, yeah, I would not trust my own translation into Dutch, for instance.
I guess that question is related to the issue of reverse translation. So normally we translate a foreign language into our native language, but there are cases where people translate from the native tongue to English. So this is something that I've been exploring recently, and I've been working on a poetry translation project, which translates the rewriting of the 6 Dalai Lama's poetry in Mandarin, and my work is to translate the Mandarin version into English. So I was doubtful at some point, can you actually do this? To what extent are you qualified to take the role of a translator and render a text into your foreign language? So I don't know if people have thoughts and insights to share on this subject, reverse translation. Susan, do you want to say something?
Sorry, I just missed. I was reading the next question that just came up, and I missed the last part of what you said. So.
Oh, I'm asking about reverse translation. Do you translate from a foreign from your native language to a foreign language or an additional language?
Yes, as I said, because my mother tongue is definitely English, although since the age of 18, I've been living in French and Spanish as well as my third language. So I do translate children's books into French, but otherwise, although I have no trouble reading French or writing in French, I don't feel I have that sensibility that comes from actually growing up in the language.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's I just don't feel comfortable. I know that there are people who do it, and it is done, but you have to be even more aware of the fact that you are an intermediary between cultures and feel comfortable with cultural fluency at the very least, if not linguistic fluency. But I want to just go back to your question that Ruth asked about considering about parts of the language that are sacred. I think, Ruth, you yourself you are very familiar with this as well, but it's that whole notion of nothing about us without us. And if you don't, if you're going to go to there, if the community tells you that this is sacred knowledge that cannot be revealed, then it is not your right to be translating that. A community has to give you permission to do that. So I would be very, very uncomfortable translating something to which I know I don't have the cultural right to translate. And that's a very different, that again is so specific to cultures. Not all cultures share that sense of sacred and copyright in particular works, in particular areas. They reserve it for other areas. I know there was the translation or the film made recently of Tandom Kolozana's novel, A Man Who Is Not a Man. And a lot of this has to do with the initiation ceremony. I cannot think of the translation. It won or was shortlisted for the best foreign language film a year or two ago. I can find the title for you. But one of the problems is that it deals with a secret ritual, the circumcision rituals, and gives you insights. But how do you deal with that kind of material where you cannot reveal certain cultural practices because it's only initiates who can have that knowledge, but not doing there. So there are ways of describing around it without ever getting to it. But again, you cannot do so. Tando is Umkosa himself. He gets it. He helped with the script. There are ways to do it, but you have to do that collaboration and have the permission from the community to even go near that kind of material.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Ruth and I are working on the translation of her book. Yeah, she published collection of short stories about the Cree people. So we're still learning how to navigate the legal issues because I'm pitching to a Chinese publisher about her book and they're very interested. But things are at a halt, a stop now, or a kind of, yeah, so it's a complicated process. And I think, again, you know, Peter mentioned this needs collaboration from every different angles and directions. It's a very complicated process, especially you want to work internationally, right? If you're collaborating with publishers outside Canada, you know, it can be.
This is the kind of situation where a discussion may lead you to a point to say that rather than give the specifics of a particular set of knowledge, you can maybe talk around it. And instead of offering in the translation of that specific, culturally specific and protected material, you can talk about the importance of why this is translated and give a broad outline of what is happening in the process and then move on. And so, but again, this is what is the community comfortable with? What is the, and what will the audience, the readership audience be comfortable with? And I see you can see a tail in. There we are. So these are difficult questions and ones that cannot be, I don't think there are generalized answers to any of this kind of stuff. It's just really difficult.
Yeah, I feel, you know, case specificity is a nature of literary translation, I guess. We can't discuss a translation of dialects or metaphor in general, right? There's no space for generalizations in the area of literary translation. We have to be specific, looking at a specific case. So that's my kind of learning from this discussion. Are there any other questions? I
have to say that the first years I worked as a translator, that's what I thought as well, Lily, but I find I went to and did my master's in Paris, and there was a wonderful woman who started a faculty there called Danica Seleskovich. So she was an interpreter, but she had a school of translators and interpreters, and they called about this interpretive theory of translation, where very simple, it's not one of those theories that become mathematical formula, but where you have more or less comprehension, deverbalization, re-expression, things like making sure that you get across the same notionality and emotionality. And I found putting general terms on that actually give me free leeway. It still helped me instead of, so now when I come up with a project, I never think, oh, this is an entity unto itself. It is. Everyone, I'm going to come up with different solutions, but it's within that larger framework. And personally, I find that framework has helped me a great deal.
Okay, great.
I do want to, if I could move the conversation a little bit, we're getting caught into very specific case specifics here, but one of the things that we were talking about was how to find a publisher and how to find material. And I think the American Literary Translators Association has some very, very good handbooks that outline how to go about these processes. So they have, I've got a couple here that I've downloaded, which is breaking into print, how to prepare a proposal, and many, many others. So I think it's worth looking at that, and also to look at who is doing translation, working in translation in Canada. I think we can't get away from funding in Canada. Canada Council, for instance, is the Canada Council has the Arts Across Canada project, which translates Canadian literary works into French, English, and Aboriginal or Inuit and Métis language, American Sign Language, or French Sign Language, and so other Canadian regional or Indigenous sign languages. But there's nothing that talks about heritage languages or funding the translation of heritage languages, or translating Canadian works into heritage languages for access. And so as long as you're translating Canadian works from English into French and from French into English or into Indigenous languages, you're okay with funding. If you aren't, then you don't have funding. So it becomes really difficult to publish these works as well when the funding processes don't allow for it. When you're looking at the Governor General's awards, the same criteria apply, is that it's English to French and French into Indigenous languages. That's where it goes. But there is nothing that offers any recognition of work that is being translated into heritage languages, into languages that reach beyond Canada. That said, there are moments like Canada is the guest nation at the Frankfurt Book Fair. And with that, Germany has sent over several delegations to elicit translations of Canadian works into German, for instance. So I think we don't have enough time here, but talking about how funding is limited and where the funding is directed in Canada has a lot to say about where we go in terms of multiculturalism. So we have a problem, for instance, with your project where you're trying to take Cree texts that are now being Cree writers in English and translating it into Mandarin. There's a problem because there isn't local funding available for that kind of work, which is incredibly important work, I believe, but we don't have access to funding. So we have to search for alternative means, which makes it more difficult. And these are biases that hamper our ability to develop in a truly multicultural nation.
Okay, great. So we are moving closer. We still have 6 minutes to go. So I want to respond to the chat room question from Ruth. Any thought about what to do when the Indigenous languages have parts that are, I think Peter have already addressed part of it, right? Yeah, I think, the suspicion about translating or about translation has to do with cultural trauma, because you think about Indigenous people, they are traumatized by the history of colonization and they're still struggling with it. So in order to open up, they tend to close, at least that's what I read from Ruth's questions here. I think that has to do with the collective trauma of being colonized. I'm kind of compare and contrast. Now it seems to me I'm not in a position to comment on the political situation, but I have the feeling that China is now closing to the Western world, let's say, and it kind of closed many doors of cultural communication, which is very sad. I'm sad to say this. But literary translators are committed to connection and to build bridges among languages and among cultures. So I do understand why there's suspicions about translation, about the powerful position of a translator or the privilege of a translator. but again, you know, I think communication is key in order to build a peaceful world. You know, I'm kind of generalizing again, but so that's my standpoint as a literary translator. Yeah.
I'd like to thank Ruth and Elizabeth for their questions. It's great to be able to bounce ideas off each other, and Peter and Lily has been great. Elizabeth had another question about rendering one accent into another or one dialect into another. Personally, I haven't had to come up against that much, but I love what you've seen being done in theater, for example. Écous, written in English, being done in Quebec with a Quebec accent and Quebec words and Quebec. I just totally adore what's being done there. But once again, that asks to really push boundaries and to see it in a new way and to make it and to take it into the new culture. And
Okay.
it looks like we have very little time left.
Yeah, we probably want to say goodbye to everyone, and it's such a great honor to be able to host the discussion. And I really appreciate the audience and the contribution from the panelists. I've learned a lot, and I hope we can continue our conversation by going to the Discord that Sophie advised in the chat. So I'll hand over to, again, I want to express my sincere gratitude for Writers Guild of Alberta for their support of this panel discussion. And also I want to express my gratitude for the support from Literary Translators Association of Canada, and specifically Bilal Hashmi, who has been supporting me, organizing the whole thing and planning the details. And so a great thank you to you all.